Martin Luther King Jr., written by AmberElizabeth Addison-Scott, a part of the Civil Rights collection of the I Am series, narrated by AmberElizabeth Addison-Scott. Dedications. I dedicate this book to my wonderful children, Cairo James and Nayana. I also want to dedicate this book to every student I've taught and every student I will teach in the future. April 4th, 1968, 6:01 p.m. The gunshot resounded loudly. The bullet pierced through my cheek. I lay on the ground, completely deaf to my surroundings. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat as my mind traveled back in time, back to the days of my childhood. January 15th, 1929, 12 noon. That's the day I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Oh, who am I? My name is Martin Luther King Jr. When I was born, my name was Michael King, as well as my dad's. My dad changed our names after he took a trip to Germany in 1934. He attended the Fifth Baptist World Alliance Congress in Berlin, where he learned about Martin Luther, the German reformer. That's when my dad decided to change our names. He wanted to honor Martin Luther. 1930 to 1944. I was the second born to my parents. I have an older sister. Her name is Willie Christine, and a younger brother. His name is Alfred Daniel. I entered public school in 1934 at the age of 5, and I attended segregated schools. Black and white kids were not allowed to go to the same schools. This is how I lost my first childhood friend. We weren't allowed to go to the same schools, and eventually, his father stopped allowing him to play with me. When I was a kid, one of my favorite things to do was sing. Once, when I was 10, I got to sing with my church choir at the Gone with the Wind movie premiere in Atlanta. Mama was an organist and a choir leader, and she used to take me around Atlanta to different churches so that I could sing. I received a lot of recognition for singing I Want to Be More and More Like Jesus, and got to join the junior choir at my church, Ebenezer Baptist. My parents were both very devout Christians. My daddy was the pastor of our church. My mom grew up like my siblings and I did, a preacher's kid. Her daddy first pastored our church before he passed. My daddy grew up a sharecropper's son and was raised to uphold integrity and a genuine Christian character. The upbringing of my parents caused them both to confront segregation and discrimination. I was baptized in May of 1936 when I was 7, but at that time it really didn't have much meaning to me. I enjoyed learning and education. When I entered high school attending Booker T. Washington High School, I skipped both the 9th and 11th grades. I graduated 2 years early at the age of 15 in 1944. 1944 to 1955. I started Morehouse College in Atlanta in 1944 when I was 15. While I was there, I first studied both medicine and law, but settled on and graduated with a sociology degree. Morehouse was the only college for black men in the nation. Because of this, Morehouse was the alma mater for both my dad and grandpa. I graduated at the age of 19 in 1948 and chose to continue my schooling at the Closer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. I was elected class president, was my class's valedictorian, and graduated in 1951 with a second bachelor's in divinity. My dad was a big supporter of me continuing my education, so once again, I enrolled in college, this time at Boston University's School of Theology. One of the best days of my life happened while I was in Boston. I met the lady who would become my wife. Her name was Addison-Scott. She was an aspiring singer and musician and attended the New England Conservatory School in Boston. We got married on June 18, 1953, on the front lawn of her parents' home in Hyberger, Alabama. While working on my thesis for my PhD, I became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954. I graduated on June 5th, 1955 with my PhD. Do you know how old I was? Only 25. 5 months later, on November 17th, 1955, Coretta and I welcomed our first child, a daughter. We named her Yolanda. My time as a civil rights activist began soon after. 1955 to 1963. On December 1st, 1955, E.D. Nixon, who was the head of the local NAACP chapter, met with myself and a few other leaders. He wanted to discuss initiating a citywide Montgomery bus boycott. Earlier in the day, a woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. I was chosen to lead the boycott. The boycott began on December 5th, 1955, and ended on December 20th, 1956, lasting for 381 days. During the boycott, we all walked to work and other destinations. Those of us who had cars created a carpool, but many of us walked to and from our destinations. During this time, both mine and Mr. Nixon's homes were attacked. My house was bombed on September 30th, 1956. People were upset about the success of the boycott. A lot of the boycott participants were often met with violence and retaliation. Despite the hardship we faced, we persevered. On June 5th, 1956, a Montgomery federal court ruled in our favor, stating that any law requiring segregation on public transportation violated the 14th Amendment. Even with this ruling, the battle was not yet over. The city appealed the ruling to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in our favor on December 20th, 1956, ruling that the buses must become integrated. The next day, all buses were integrated. Because of our success with the Montgomery bus boycott in January 1957, myself, Ralph Abernathy, and 60 other civil rights leaders and activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Our goal was to conduct nonviolent protests to bring about civil rights reform. That year, on October 23rd, Coretta and I welcomed our second child, a boy. We named him Martin Luther King III. When I was in college, I was introduced to the teachings and beliefs of Mahatma Gandhi. Because of his influence his beliefs had on me, I took a trip to his birthplace in India in 1959. It was so enlightening and inspiring. Shortly after, in February 1960, a group of African American students started the sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina. The sit-in movement was a form of protest that would occur by colored people sitting at segregated lunch counters and refusing to move. This would cause them both verbal and physical abuse. In April of 1960, the SCLC held a conference in which I spoke, encouraging students to continue using their nonviolent protest methods. By August of 1960, the sit-in protest became successful and ended segregation at lunch counters in 27 southern cities. That same year, I returned home with my family to Atlanta to help my father pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, my childhood church. Of course, I continued my civil rights activism. On October 19, 1960, 75 students and I entered a local department store for lunch service, but were denied. 37 of us were arrested for refusing to move. Eventually, the charges were dropped because the mayor of Atlanta called a truce. Even though the charges were dropped, I was still placed on probation and was soon arrested again for a traffic ticket. You may be wondering how I was released, right? Well, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy heard of my arrest, and because of his concern, political pressure had been set, and I was soon released. I was a living testament that not all black men in jail are bad people. On January 30th, 1961, a new addition was added to my family. My second son, Dexter, was born. Even though the year started off amazing with the birth of my third child, it didn't end as well. I was arrested again December 16, 1961 in Albany, Georgia, when police executed a mass arrest of peaceful demonstrators. This time I was offered bail, but I declined until the city made concessions. I was eventually released, but upon my return to the city in July of 1962, I was rearrested and sentenced to an option of either 45 days in jail or a fine of $178. I chose jail. I believe God was on my side because 3 days into my sentence, the police chief arranged for my fine to be paid and released me. The spring of the following year bred new beginnings and a beautiful new blossom. My baby girl Bernice was born on March 28, 1963. Oh, what a beautiful day. 1963 to 1968. A month after my daughter's birth, myself, along with the SCLC, began a campaign against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. We occupied public spaces with marches and sit-ins. During our protest, the city police officials turned dogs and fire hoses on us. They spared no one. Even children were attacked. Many times during the marches, protesters were arrested, including me. While in jail, I urged protesters to remember our non-violent stance. We would have to persevere through the struggles and pain to see results. I wrote the letters from Birmingham jail during this time. Eventually, I was released and the Birmingham campaign came to an end. The protesters and I, as well as other organizations, made plans for a major demonstration on the nation's capital. This would take place August 28, 1963. More than 200,000 people attended and stood in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. It was there that I gave my famous I Have a Dream speech. Because of the growing attention the movement received, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. This stated that the federal government could enforce desegregation and outlaw discrimination in public-owned places. The blessings kept coming. 1964 was also the year that I earned the Nobel Peace Prize, October 14, 1964 to be exact. However, the struggle was still far from being over. City officials across the South were refusing to abide by the Civil Rights Act. The movement carried on to St. Augustine, Florida, Selma, Alabama, and even made its way up north to Chicago, Illinois. The battles of Selma had to have been some of the most difficult. Why? Bloody Sunday. On March 5, 1965, I met with officials of the Lyndon B. Johnson administration to request an injunction against prosecution of the protesters who intended to march from Selma to Montgomery. They were marching to not only protest the injustices, but also the inability to register to vote and the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson. Sunday, March 7, 1965, a mass group of activists and protesters, not including me, set out to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Once they crossed the county line and reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met by state troopers and sheriffs. They attacked the marchers with nightsticks and tear gas. Many protesters were beat into unconsciousness. The attack was televised. 17 marchers were hospitalized. We attempted to arrange a second march, but were denied due to a restraining order that prevented the march from taking place. On March 9th, a third attempt began, this time with me heading the front of the line. We set out again with 2,500 marchers, both black and white. We didn't want to violate the restraining order, so once we reached the bridge, which was barricaded and guarded by state troopers, I led everyone in a kneeling prayer. Then we turned back. The governor of Alabama tried again to prevent us from marching, but this time we had the support of President Johnson. He ordered the U.S. Army troops and the Alabama National Guard to protect us. On March 21st, about 2,000 people, once again, began to march from Selma to Montgomery. On March 25th, the number of marchers had grown to 25,000. We gathered in front of the state capitol, and I delivered my televised "How Long, Not Long" speech. 5 months later, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. From 1965 to 1967, we continued to expand the civil rights effort into other cities. April 4th, 1968, 6:01 p.m. I stood on the balcony of my hotel room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, weary from all that I've persevered through. Just one day prior, I gave my last speech. I've been to the mountaintop at the Mason Temple. As I reflected on the words that I spoke, I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. A trigger was pulled. The gunshot resounded loudly. The bullet pierced through my cheek. I laid on the ground, reflecting on my life, and now knowing that I was free at last. We celebrate the life, legacy, and memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We thank him for his work and dedication to the equal treatment of African Americans. To learn more about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., visit www.thekingcenter.org. Visit the Martin Luther King National Historical Park in Atlanta, Georgia. Visit the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. About the author. AmberElizabeth Addison-Scott is an Austin, Texas native. She began writing at the age of 9 and published her first poetry book at the age of 10. She has dedicated her life to both teaching and writing, and has recently served as a kindergarten teacher in Austin, Texas. She has received 2 associate's degrees from Austin Community College and is a third-generation legacy graduate of Houston-Tillotson University, and is currently pursuing her Master's of Education in Language and Literacy. She has been a part of the National Black Book Festival, and she is also the founder of Books by Amber and the Central Texas Black Authors Gala. About the series. The I Am series is an easy-read bibliographic series of African American leaders for young readers grades 1st through 6th. The series is divided into 10 collections: the Civil Rights Collection, the Abolitionist Collection, the Inventors Collection, the Harlem Renaissance Collection, the Jazz Collection, the Legal Professionals Collection, the Athletes Collection, the Historians Collection, the Politicians Collection, and the Children's Collection. Collect them all!